Look, even mediocre bacon is still pretty tasty. I mean, that one's a little floppy, and these guys have a little too much color, but that's okay. I'm gonna still eat them. That said, we all deserve better, right? So let's take a look at the different ways to cook bacon and figure out how to make sure that every strip is perfect, no matter how you define perfect. So we've all tossed a couple of slices of bacon into a skillet and turned on the heat, flipped the pieces occasionally until they're crispy. This method, it's pretty good. Barring burning the bacon, you're gonna end up with something delicious. But that doesn't mean there isn't room for improvement. I know I'm always tempted to add more slices to the pan as the bacon shrinks, and I've always thought it'd be really nice if you could cook an entire package on the stove. I mean, yes, the oven is a good option, but it's just not always available. And then there are the annoying inconsistencies. Some of the pieces are always a little too floppy or flabby. Some of them get charred. Sometimes those meaty bits are so far gone that they're like dry and brittle instead of crispy. So let's take a look at why this method is so inconsistent. Throughout this video, I'm going to be using Oscar Mayer brand bacon. It's the AGK Reviews team's top pick. I've got 5 slices here. I'm just going to get them in this 12-inch skillet. So I'm going to cook these 5 slices of bacon. They're in a 12-inch skillet. I didn't bother preheating it because I really want to render the fat out. And I'm going to set my heat to medium, and that's hot enough to render out the fat, which is great. But that's also the reason these strips are buckling. The meaty bits are contracting a little bit more than the fatty bits, and so you see kind of those hills and valleys forming as the bacon strips start to contract. So you can see that we're starting to get color on the pan, and that means that the bits where the bacon is touching the skillet, they're probably just starting to pick up color as well. This is kind of usually when people start flipping these pieces, right? Just to make sure that they're cooking evenly. This is all familiar, right? I'm not telling you anything you don't know. So this entire process, waiting for the bacon to render, waiting for the browning to happen, it's kind of slow going. I don't know about you, but I always underestimate how long it takes to cook bacon. You just have to keep an eye on things and move the bacon around so that it cooks evenly. So the thing I'm paying the most attention to here is the way the fat is kind of bubbling its way out of the bacon strips, and I'm paying attention to the sound. That sizzling sound, that's water leaving, and the more water leaves, the faster the bacon will brown and the crispier it gets. And so I want to wait for the sound to soften, and I want the bubbles to get smaller. If you are paying attention, you'll notice that these are maybe 1/4-inch size bubbles at the largest. I want to cook this bacon until those bubbles get to be maybe about 1/8 of an inch in size. That's when you're going to have a chewy, tender bacon. And then for those of you who really like crispy bacon, you want those bubbles to get so small that it looks like there's kind of a foam covering the strips as opposed to like distinct bubbles. The sound is also really important. Quiet bacon is crispy bacon. Pay attention to how loud your sizzle is, and when you can barely hear it, that's a good sign that your bacon is crispy. The sizzling sound has diminished quite a bit. It's sounding crispy, so I'm going to pull this out. Okay, so here's what I see in this bacon. I'm gonna give it maybe a B+. It looks good, but it's a little under here, a little floppy. That fat is clearly not fully rendered. I don't love how dark it is, like this piece. It's fine. It's not as crispy as I'd want. The meaty bits are eating a little dense and dry. I really feel like I can do better. The question is, how do we get a more consistent cook and better texture? The thing I find frustrating about bacon cooked in a skillet is that it takes a lot of time to get those kind of B+ results. And you're pretty much tethered to the stove, making sure that the bacon doesn't burn. Now, you could put a weight down on top of the bacon that's going to flatten it against the pan so that you get uniform browning, but not everyone has a weight. There is something that everyone does have that can solve the problems of uneven browning and dryness: water. You just want to add a 1/4 cup of water to the bacon and bring the whole thing to a simmer. That's enough to barely cover the bacon. The water heats the bacon more evenly and gently than the skillet alone, and it keeps the parts that are touching the skillet from browning too soon, so there's less flipping and tending required. There's minimal buckling and no browning happening while we're rendering out the fat. By the time the water's gone, though, enough fat has rendered out and it can take over the job of delivering heat to any areas that aren't touching the pan. Now we're frying. So what's kind of fun about this method is that you can modify it to cook an entire package of bacon in one skillet. So for that package, you're going to need 1 cup of water. And then you can start adding your bacon. It's going to go in 2 layers, and I find it easier to arrange the second layer so that it's perpendicular to the first. I like to get the water in the pan first because the water is going to keep the slices from sticking to each other. And I don't stress if they're overlapping slightly. I know this looks ridiculous, but it really does work. So now I just want to bring this water to a simmer. This whole simmering part, it's going to take 15 to 20 minutes depending on your stove or your pan. And I know that sounds like a long time, but honestly, cooking just 6 slices of bacon takes you maybe 10-15 minutes, so this isn't actually that much longer and you get a lot more bacon. So once the water evaporates and the bacon starts to fry, you just kind of start stirring. The bacon's never going to shrink so much that everything will fit in an even layer, and so there's always going to be bits kind of sticking up above the fat. But there's also enough fat that we're kind of shallow frying the bacon, and that stirring just moves anything that isn't submerged so that it is submerged and you get even cooking. So I don't worry about these pieces overlapping or tangling. The goal here is just movement to get them to brown evenly. I'm also keeping an eye out for those visual cues we talked about earlier. Small bubbles for slightly chewy bacon, foam for crispy bacon, and I'm listening. As they brown and finish cooking, I'm going to fish them out when the piece looks done and sounds done. At this point, I do want to make sure that I arrange them so that they're flat on the paper towels. The thing about these bacon strips is that while they're hot, they're really bendy, even after they brown. It's only when they cool that they become rigid, unless you like your bacon chewy and tender, in which case, your cooled bacon may still be a little bit floppy. So I really do just want to keep these pieces moving around. Anything that's like a little bit pale, I'm making sure that that part gets submerged under the hot fat so that it picks up color and renders and cooks and crisps. Also, we're at the point where I would fish these out if I wanted my bacon to be a little bit chewy. You can see these bubbles. You can tell how big they are, and that says chewy to me. I'm going to let this go a little bit further, though. I want a little bit more foam for a crispier bacon. So this is looking pretty close. At this point, I want to make sure that any bacon that I'm pulling out, I'm arranging so that it's flat. So I really love how uniformly browned all the pieces are, even though they're clearly not flat. I just want to give one of these a try. The browning is super uniform. We're not seeing any dark bits on any of the meaty areas. The fat is really nicely rendered. The really nice thing about that added water is the meaty bits, they're going to pick up some of that water. The water turns to steam and it kind of poofs and expands that part a tiny bit. They're not quite as dense and heavy and brittle, and there's just a friable texture to it that's really awesome. So that's stovetop methods. Now, if you want a more hands-off method, you're going to need your oven. Stovetop methods are nice, but when you need to make a lot of bacon, then you should be using your oven. It lets you cook a lot of bacon really evenly, and it frees up the stove for other dishes. I'm kind of assuming that if you're cooking multiple packages of bacon, you're probably also making a couple of other things. You can bake 1 or 2 trays at a time. It's up to you. When you're laying the strips out, it's okay if the pieces touch. You just don't want them to overlap. You know how bacon is kind of extensible like that? There's no reason to stretch the bacon out. It's not going to get you longer strips or anything. It just means you can't fit quite as many slices onto the pan. Okay, so I've got a pound of bacon on this sheet pan that's a package, and I'm just going to pop this into a 400-degree oven. I'll give it a spin after 5 minutes, and the whole thing will be done in 12 to 15 minutes. So while that bacon's in the oven, let's talk about some of the words we see on packaging and what they mean. First up, I have center cut. Center cut bacon is lovely because it has a little bit less fat, and here's how they make it. So if they were to slice a full pork belly, you'd end up with something closer to this length. On either end of that belly, you're going to find a good amount of fat, and that's the bit that they trim. Because this ends up being waste, they'll charge you more for this. And so, yes, you're getting less fat, but you're also paying for it. Let's talk about nitrite-free and uncured bacon. I have a package of bacon here that is uncured, and below it, it says no nitrites or nitrates added. So nitrates and nitrites are curing salts. They're used to extend the shelf life. They keep bad bugs from growing, so your bacon will keep. Producers can say that their bacon is uncured, they didn't use a curing salt, or nitrite and nitrate free when they don't use sodium nitrite or sodium nitrate. That said, there are ingredients out there that contain nitrites, and they can use those. If they are using those other ingredients, then they can say it's uncured and that they didn't add any nitrites or nitrates. If you check the ingredients on these packages, you'll often see something like celery powder or maybe dried celery juice. That's a natural ingredient that contains a good amount of nitrates. And in fact, our reviews team sent a bunch of samples of bacon, both cured and uncured, to a lab to have them analyzed for the amount of nitrites they contain. And in certain cases, the nitrite-free stuff actually contained more nitrites than something that is cured, where they will disclose that, yes, we did use sodium nitrite in this bacon. Last up, we have thick-cut bacon. So I have two samples here, and the thick-cut bacon is significantly thicker than the thin-cut. This might seem obvious, but the thicker-cut bacon takes a little bit longer to cook. It's got more water in there, and you have to drive that water off before it gets crispy. So if you really want your bacon to cook quickly, and if you like crispy bacon, it's really best to stick to the conventional stuff. If I'm using bacon as an ingredient in another dish, say a pasta, I kind of like thick cut bacon. It's a little bit more substantial, and in most cases, I'm not worried about it staying crispy, so I don't care that it's harder to fully cook out. Whatever style of bacon you're looking for, the ATK app is a great resource. Bacon's done. I want to get these strips onto paper towels to drain as quickly as possible. They're just a lot easier to remove from the sheet while they're hot. I just can't say no to bacon. So this method is awesome if you're trying to make a lot of bacon, but if I'm not trying to make enough bacon to serve a crowd, I kind of prefer the stove, if only because I don't have to wait for a stove to preheat before the cooking starts. So the next time you need a lot of bacon, I recommend our oven-fried bacon recipe. And if you're making just a couple of servings, grab a skillet and add water. Remember, quiet bacon is crispy bacon. I'd love to know how you like your bacon. Crispy or chewy? Thick or thin? Flat or ruffled? Let me know in the comments.